Okay. Welcome back, Straight Talkers. I'm Dr. Rob. Today we're going to go over methylphenidate products and Wellbutrin. We're going to talk about why you can use them both conjunctively at the same time. This actually came from a question a couple weeks ago that I addressed last week. I spoke wrong. Tyler H. So kindly pointed that out to me and let me down very easily about that. I was misspeaking because I was talking about amphetamine products. Focalin is not an amphetamine product. It is a methylphenidate product. So if you watched last week's video, that does still hold true for amphetamine products, but I'm going to address the methylphenidate stuff today better. So let's dive into that. There's Tyler H's comment. I do appreciate the calling me out for it so I can correct it. Real quick, methylphenidate versus amphetamine, they are two totally different structures. And so the derivatives of what we get from those structures are different. Amphetamine, for example, will give rise to methamphetamine. It will give rise to MDMA, that's ecstasy. Here's a quick list of the different products from methylphenidate to amphetamine medications, the generic or the brand names. So just to point out, yeah, there is a difference between an amphetamine and methamphetamine, methylphenidate. This picture, I wish I actually had this picture for last week because this is a better picture than I think what I put up there, and I hope it comes out super clear on the video. This tries to show both amphetamines and methylphenidate products and how they generally work on the neuron, but keeping it relatively simple. So for the left half of that nerve, ignore that for right now because that's amphetamines. On the right half of this picture is where trying to show what the methylphenidate products do. Methylphenidate and its derivatives work on dopamine and norepinephrine transporters, and it does so by blocking them. To the best of our knowledge, we don't think that those products have any effect on actually driving out dopamine and norepinephrine into the space in between neurons. At least it hasn't been proven. So in this picture in particular has a dopamine neuron. Methylphenidate, you see the big red line across that transporter. It's supposed to be bringing dopamine back into the nerve in order to repackage it so it can be used again. Methylphenidate blocks it, keeps that purple dopamine structure in between the space of the two neurons. That way the talking neuron is more potent to the listening neuron. This is another picture of it. This is the one that I used last week with Wellbutrin. I like this little schematic as well. Same exact concept. This one's showing two neurons, a norepinephrine neuron and a dopamine neuron. And the orange balls are the balls that represent Wellbutrin. And I guess, yeah, it could represent a methylphenidate in the most basic sense. It blocks those gray ovals. It doesn't allow the green little balls to be taken back up into the talking neurons, the presynaptic neurons. And so there's more green balls in that space to be talking to the listening nerve, that pink nerve at the bottom. So that is the general mechanism of how Wellbutrin works. And yes, methylphenidate and Wellbutrin are somewhat similar, but you can use them together clinically. And that's because there is a difference in the mechanism of action. It's just very nuanced and it takes a bit more of a discussion. So it's going to get a little hairy. At the very end of that explanation, I'm going to wrap it together with three main points as to why that makes sense. And through this, if you have any comments, I'm going to try to or questions, I'm going to try to answer them to the best that I can. We've also got a couple more questions and comments that I'm going to point out at the very end of the video. And we've pretty much mopped up most of the comments from the previous handful of months. So moving forward, we're going to talk about just comments and questions from the previous week, just so you know. So if you got new questions or comments, leave them in the comments section on the channel. Back to methylphenidate and Wellbutrin. So they seemingly both work the same. Methylphenidate is approximately 10 times stronger than Wellbutrin when being attracted to and binding to the norepinephrine transporters and the dopamine transporters. If you take a Wellbutrin molecule and a methylphenidate molecule and you line them up head to head and they're trying to get to the same receptor, methylphenidate is going to win out almost every time. Methylphenidate doesn't use the other proteins that are inside of the neuron, like that I was talking about last week, the VMAT proteins. There is hypotheses that float around about whether or not methylphenidate products do reverse the transporter somehow. So instead of that transporter sucking dopamine and norepinephrine back up into the cell, is methylphenidate somehow reversing that? It's been thrown around as a theory, but never been proven. The amphetamines can reverse it, but I won't go into that right now. If Wellbutrin and methylphenidate both essentially do the same thing, methylphenidate is stronger. Why use Wellbutrin at all? That we got to go down the Wellbutrin path here for just a second, because Wellbutrin is an antidepressant medicine. It's not considered a stimulant, and it's mostly because of how strong it is, on top of not necessarily knowing all the mechanism. Wellbutrin, when we clinically dose it, will occupy roughly between 10 to 30% of the receptors, the dopamine and norepinephrine transporters, when you're getting good antidepressant clinical effect. In comparison, when we dose out SSRI medications, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, we know that 80 to 90% of the serotonin transporters are being occupied for an antidepressant effect. So there's a big discrepancy there. And so that it's caused a lot of questions and theories as to what is Wellbutrin doing to give us that antidepressant effect. Some researchers and PhDs think that you should need to have that 80 to 90% occupancy on those dopamine and norepinephrine transporters to give you that effect. But it doesn't, at least not that we can prove. And so it raises questions of whether or not there's alternative mechanisms of action. Is there some more downstream effects inside the cell that we don't really understand? Is there an effect on serotonin that we haven't figured out? We don't know. But for Wellbutrin having such a seemingly weaker affinity, which affinity just means strength for the receptor, why does it have such a good clinical strong outcome? Over the last 5 to 7 years, we've studied more of its metabolites. When you swallow a lot of different medications, but in particular Wellbutrin, your body breaks it down into a few different components. And those components, metabolites, are also active with the dopamine and norepinephrine transporters, but we don't really know them completely. The most potent of these is radafaxine. And radafaxine is the hydroxybupropion on the bottom there, but this is a schematic of what Wellbutrin gets broken down to after you ingest it. So that's my short-ish explanation, as saying, well, we know that there's a lot of metabolites. We haven't fully explored all those metabolites. We know they affect the dopamine and norepinephrine transporters just as Wellbutrin does. Radafaxine seems to be the most clinically relevant out of all of them, because that one seems to give such a good potent response to the smoking cessation, to the pain tolerance, to energy levels. GlaxoSmithKline actually owns that, and they're still trying to study that in depth to come out with new products because of the versatility of Wellbutrin that is just a little not totally understood. Let's go back to why we use Wellbutrin at all. This kind of comes down to the mechanism that we do understand about Wellbutrin compared to methylphenidate products. There's short-acting, high occupancy medications that will block dopamine and norepinephrine very, very strongly. That can cause euphoria and reinforcement and addiction. You get high and you get addicted. That's how cocaine works. There's the moderate acting medications with a high occupancy that give us a good response, good focus, and a consistent stimulating effect. That helps us treat the ADHD symptoms. That is like what methylphenidate and the methylphenidate products can do. And then there's longer acting and slower occupancy, just like with what we were discussing with earlier about Wellbutrin, how it affects 10 to 30% of the receptors. That is what's hypothesized to give the antidepressant effect from what we know. It's slower acting, longer acting, and it doesn't modulate serotonin that we're aware of. That may be why we get such a good, slow feel good without getting the highs and the lows of some of the more potent stimulants. So, Wellbutrin, methylphenidate products. Why can you use them together? One's far more potent than the other. One is much more slow and longer acting. Wellbutrin may be working in different mechanisms of action than we're aware of. We just haven't figured it out yet. Slower onset, longer acting is good for maybe even dampening some of the highs and lows from some of the more potent, harder hitting stimulants. And that would make clinical sense. So hopefully that rectifies what I was saying last week about the amphetamines. It is a little bit more convoluted, though, based off of the mechanism of action and the lack of complete knowledge of Wellbutrin and how it gets broken down to in its metabolites. I do have a couple of comments and questions from earlier in the week. Hillary said, hello, I'm on week 2, and she's talking about Wellbutrin here. I've had a really bad stomach pain and nausea. Has anyone else had this? Should I stop? I just want to be happy, which brings up another point. Any and all the information that you hear from any of our videos, make sure that you talk to your own prescriber and provider about it, because you as an individual may have a different situation than to the generalities that we talk about. But on week 2, I have a really bad stomach pain and nausea. Should I stop? I just want to be happy. This kind of goes to the point of, are we talking about dose-dependent side effects or time-dependent side effects? Dose-dependent side effects are if you continue to take more of that medication, you're going to get more and more of those side effects. A time-dependent side effect, and that's how many of the SSRI antidepressant type medications work, because we're changing that neurochemical balance in between in our brain. Many times you get a side effect up front, your body gets used to that new neurotransmitter level, and those side effects wane away as the weeks go on. Generally, it does take at least 2 weeks for many of the time-dependent side effects to ease off. But you can see on this graph here, easily 3, 4, 5 weeks to really start ramping down to a level that's more tolerable. Stomach pains, nausea, definitely a side effect of Wellbutrin. Should I stop? Well, the question that I ask my patients is it tolerable? Are you outright miserable? Are you more miserable than without the medication? That's only something that you can answer. Should I stop? Certainly, I can't give you that information of whether or not you should stop. But know in the back of your mind, if you're through that 2 weeks, generally speaking, for Wellbutrin and a lot of antidepressant medicines, if you're experiencing time dependent side effects, you should notice some fairly significant improvement coming over the next couple of days to weeks. Um, so I would say hang in there if you can tolerate it. Um, but that's a judgment everybody's got to make with the experiences that they're having. We got Kyle here. I was just prescribed this medication from my doctor. I'm nervous to take it. I got it on Thursday. Talking about Ritalin, commenting from the Ritalin video. It's a super common. It should you should have some not hesitancy but some self-awareness that yes, these medications are potent, they are strong, the side effect profiles are large. I do want to kind of jump over to the or the drugs.com page here real quick and just kind of show people what I do with many of the patients that I prescribe any medication to. Go to drugs.com, put in the medication that you're nervous of or considering starting. Search it out. Go down to the medication with the gold star on it. Click on the side effects. You are going to get a big long list of side effects. Even aspirin has that. Don't freak out about that. Go through the side effects. Go through the common ones, the less common ones, the rare ones. I like to go and scroll all the way down to the bottom here, if it loads, for healthcare professionals, because here they put in things like whether things are common, whether things are very common, and they give a percentage range. Like what are the chances that I'm going to experience a side effect of this medication if I were to take it? So I think that generally helps patients, or at least give some numbers to patients to understand, okay, what realistically could I experience if I get a side effect of this medication? If I get a side effect of the medication, how likely is it to happen, and how bad is it? Um, and having that resource of knowing where to go and look for side effects, I think helps uh, people make that decision a little bit easier, because I know just as a prescriber, I can't sit there and talk about every single one of these potential side effects. I certainly talk about the most common ones that I hear from patients all the time for any given particular medication. But all of these side effects for every medication is not doable. But that's why I want you all to have that information to help make a better decision for yourself. The Persian hillbilly mentioned that on the Concerta Vyvanse video that I alternate between the two. I'll be honest, I'm kind of curious as to what we're alternating there. I mean, obviously between the two medicines, but like to what degree? Alternating every other day, or weekly, or monthly? I'm kind of curious as to how that person got into that situation in the first place. Maybe it mechanism wise, it helps stabilize them a little bit easier. I don't know if I can speak to that. That's not common at all. That might be a unique, personalized treatment plan for that person. I Hopefully the Persian hillbilly will see this and give us some more information on that, because that is interesting. I don't know where to talk to too much for that one. Um, let's see here. Oh, too. Sorry, somebody said I should turn that music off. hopefully that music wasn't too obnoxious. Um, so methylphenidate, Wellbutrin, hopefully that made sense. If you have any more specific questions or mechanisms of action, I can see if I can look that up. Honestly, if Tyler H has a more in-depth answer as to some of the Wellbutrin mechanisms of action and why it's so clinically different from a methylphenidate product, I'd love to hear from that from him. Next week, I'm going to go talk about Xanax versus the other benzos and those mechanisms, and why we generally don't like prescribing Xanax, and why it can have such an addictive quality to it. Please leave your comments in the section below, and we'll see you guys next Tuesday at noon.